Okay, so again, good morning everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I can see we have 67 people in the room just now, and a really diverse group of people from across the housing sector. My name is Gareth James, and I'm a Knowledge Exchange Associate with the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence, based at the University of Glasgow. And before I introduce our other two speakers today, I'd just like to say a few words about this work, this project, and also the format of today's session. So first of all, the report that we're discussing today, titled Innovation in Housing Advice in the UK Private Rented Sector, has been carried out as part of a collaboration between CASH, the Housing Evidence Centre, the Dispute Service Charitable Foundation, and Safe Deposit Scotland Charitable Trust. And through this collaboration, we're undertaking a diverse programme of research on issues relating to developments in and the operation of the UK private rented sector. The broad objective of the programme is to contribute to raising standards in the UK private rented sector. And today's work, I'm sure, will also hold lessons for other parts of the housing system as well, for social housing and other advice services that are out there out with the private rented sector. So the broader theme for today is much more focused on a specific part of this work, a specific part of the report, and that is the digitalisation of advice provision and the challenges and opportunities that are associated with that. So today's session will include a 15-minute presentation by Dr. Jennifer Harris. There will then be a bit of a response from Elizabeth O'Hara. And we invite questions from you, from the audience, throughout the session as well. So please do submit your questions through the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen at any point throughout the session. You can also upvote other people's questions in that Q&A box. And also the chat function is available for you to talk to each other. I will be monitoring the Q&A box. We won't be monitoring the chat function though. So if you have a question, please make sure you put it into the Q&A box. So I think that's all of the house rules or whatever dealt with now. So without further ado, let me just quickly introduce our speakers. So first of all, the author of the report, Dr. Jennifer Harris. She is a senior research fellow with CASH and is based within the School for Policy Studies at the University of Bristol. Prior to joining CASH, Jennifer was employed as the research manager at the national voluntary sector organisation Homeless Link. Jennifer also holds a PhD from the University of Bristol, in which she explored homeless people's engagements with technology within the context of the shift to digital advice and welfare benefit services. And we're also joined today by Elizabeth O'Hara. In recent years, Elizabeth has worked in housing policy and strategy roles, but her background is very much rooted in the provision of independent advice services to those in housing need. She managed an advice service for homeless families in temporary accommodation. She was part of a specialist housing advice team for those living with HIV/AIDS. And she worked at the North Kensington Law Centre under housing legal aid contracts. She later moved to Shelter, where she developed policy on social welfare, law advice and channel shift. And since 2018, she's been an advisor to the Housing Ombudsman, continuing in a dispute resolution theme. So these are our speakers, and I'm going to now hand over to Jennifer, who's going to run through the report for us, and then we'll come back together for some discussion. Jennifer.
Can you just enable screen sharing, please? Okay, hello everybody. Thanks very much for tuning in today. As Gareth mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about sort of one particular aspect of our report, which is sort of the challenges, developments and opportunities associated with the shift to remote advice provision. Arguably, this is one of the key challenges that the sector is currently facing. Of course, it's accelerated in the last year as a result of COVID, but it's not a new phenomenon. We know sort of back in 2014, there was large-scale research done which showed a tremendous worldwide increase in the use of remote channels to provide civil legal advice. And of course, large organizations such as Shelter and Citizens Advice offer advice via an array of channels and have done so for quite some time. But that being said, sort of since 2012, as part of the UK's sort of deficit reduction program and a larger sort of program of austerity, there has been sort of a shift in funding allocations and political preferences towards remote services. We had things like the very controversial community legal advice telephone helpline introduced back in 2014, or the mandatory telephone gateway, as it's also known, or 2011, I believe that was. And across other nations, there's also been an increased focus on remote advice provision. So I know the Scottish Government has proposed to introduce a telephone triage system with national coverage. And of course, this is occurring against the background of significant reductions in public sector funding, changes to the legal aid budgets, drastically affecting the availability of face-to-face advice. Some of the other nations of the UK, the reductions haven't been quite severe. Nonetheless, across all 4 nations of the UK, we know that many people living in the private rented sector face difficult and convoluted advice journeys and significant barriers to accessing advice. We're also developing these services within a context of, of having very little information available about the successes, challenges, outcomes of different channels. And the pandemic has, of course, put pressure on an already fragile sector to adjust their practices. Many services would have been offering in-person or telephone-based advice prior to COVID, and now they're looking to use technology in more creative ways to provide remote advice. Now, the government's digital by default policy agenda has been accused of advocating sort of one-size-fits-all approach, which could potentially disadvantage people facing issues relating to digital access or digital literacy and so forth. I would say that developing new technologies it's not a neutral process. It's informed by certain assumptions regarding how people use technology, who is able to use the system, etc. And there have been, it can be argued that some of the arguments made around sort of greater efficiency, greater effectiveness of remote services have been made without taking into consideration the various sort of contextual factors that affect people's use of remote advice. So, for example, the experiences of homelessness or other experiences that people might have that frame their interactions with technologies, as well as of course, their IT skills and access to equipment and so forth. However, I would say dissenting voices sometimes also kind of present the issues, present assumptions, and that might seem commonsensical, but can also, in their own way, fail to recognize the diverse and complex ways in which various people engage with technology. So there's this commonly held assumption that certain people, such as those with experiences of homelessness, occupy the negative side of digital divide. But we know research actually shows many people who have had experiences of homelessness use technology in lots of diverse ways. And there's also sort of, I hear lots of views expressed relating to age differences. Young people are necessarily able to engage with remote advice, but actually large-scale survey research suggests that despite sort of trends in digital proficiency amongst this age group, they can experience the greatest difficulty in accessing legal information online. So this suggests, do we need a more nuanced debate? Do we need more of an appreciation of the complexities and variations surrounding how people engage with remote advice in relation to people living in the private rented sector, which I think we know very little about, but also more broadly. So our research, engaged with 6 different services from across the UK. We did just over 30 qualitative interviews with both staff and clients, and a review of about 10 years worth of legal needs literature. And there are principles and lessons over the past 10 years that can be transferred to our thinking around the future landscape of advice provision, and to talk about some of these sort of principles and lessons within the context of these different case studies. So one of the services that we engaged with developed an advice bot. It was developed by a local citizens advice bureau in England as part of a wider sort of multi-channel approach that they had. The aim was to maximize capacity of our advisors by providing a self-help digital portal for people seeking housing advice. And there's not in the UK, there's not that many of these types of tools available. A lot of sort of information is presented in, not exclusively, but often in kind of like static online web pages. So this kind of developing a more kind of interactive interface is fairly innovative within the housing advice, UK housing advice world. And there's kind of 2 different options when you're developing sort of these more interactive sort of automated chat box platforms. You can have sort of a free text conversational interface where somebody can type in what their problem is, which arguably more closely mirrors the human experience, or you can have something that's sort of uses a binary approach, a much more simple binary approach: yes, no, what tenor do you reside in, etc. And that has a clearer conversational journey, but does little to mirror the human experience. So with this service, they hope to develop this sort of free flowing text version, but after numerous reiterations, they had to sort of scale back their expectations of what this chatbot could achieve. And I'd say that it proved to be particularly challenging due to sort of general low levels of legal capability, clustering of legal problems. People were presenting the sort of walls of texts to the advice bot, weren't necessarily fully able to identify which aspects of the problem were most relevant. So they kind of went back to this kind of binary yes/no type approach, and through that they managed to resolve around 10% of queries by signposting people to information on their website, and the remainder was sort of passed on to human advisor. And for those that were passed on to the human advisor, they would then already have that information available that was inputted by the advice seeker. So that kind of provides sort of useful information for the advisor. So I say one of the key learnings of this case study would be to not assume in advance that any particular channel will be or technology or pathway will be used in a certain way. So the team said that if they were successful with it, they would be a lot more realistic in terms of what they could achieve. So knowing what groups it can work for and doing a lot more for that group rather than thinking it will work for everyone, which is where we went initially. And I think it's very much kind of, yes, it's this user-focused approach, but it's also just thinking about, what are the needs, capabilities, circumstances, preferences, priorities that people are coming to these different platforms with, and how is that perhaps shaped by people's experiences of renting within the private renter sector, not just the capabilities of the IT skills, but sort of the reality of living within a sector that is, has perpetual insecurity, those unequal power dynamics with your landlords, that fear of facing eviction, all these different things that characterize the rental experience. How does that affect people's willingness and ability to shape the willingness and ability to use online systems? And I don't think that's something we've necessarily thought about yet. I think the conversation tends to be more around sort of digital skills and proficiency, which is important as well, but it's those life experiences which will shape people's use of technology and shape the successes and shape the willingness, shape the, whether they disengage from these services after the first go and so forth. So another service we engaged with was a sustainment service, which was commissioned by a local authority in Scotland to help people living in the private rental sector avoid homelessness. And that was sort of emerged out of sort of a desire to explore solutions to the significant numbers of people or families living in temporary accommodation. They identified high levels of rent arrears and sort of diverse diverse and complex support needs among these families. And actually rent arrears was only kind of the tip of the iceberg. There was many sort of, as we know, as is often the case with civil legal housing problems, there's multiple overlapping issues that needed addressing. So I would say this is not an advice service, but part of the wider sort of advice and support ecosystem that needs to exist in order to allow advice services to operate effectively, in order to ensure that the range of needs which now exist within the sector are addressed. We know a much higher percentage of people living with various vulnerabilities are now within the sector, and and there's questions regarding whether sort of more short-term or episodic advice is always appropriate, or whether there needs to be some more kind of wraparound support to actually help people to get to those services in the first place. So this service sort of continued to work remotely during the pandemic, but actually they found maintaining engagement and communication was extremely challenging. Not only did people have very limited IT skills, but again, many of the sort of like life, the experiences, sort of a sense of mistrust, for example, other concerns, so the priorities surrounding sort of trying to meet the basic needs within the context of experience, sort of multiple and severe deprivation, acted as a barrier, acted as a wider context in which people were able to kind of shift to remote advice provision. So they had to provide very intensive one-to-one support to help people to adapt to new technologies. They were able to secure some iPads, some laptops from a charitable funder, but there was, they did have to do socially distanced visits and provide very basic sort of like, this is how you switch it on, etc. support. So this raises questions, not just for the wider, I would say, voluntary sector, the extent to which sort of digitizing services sort of displaces costs onto other areas of the voluntary sector, and also sort of the success of this service. And I don't have the stats right here, but it was very successful in reducing sort of levels of homelessness from the private rental sector in that local authority. And that success was very much based on sort of like a client-focused, relationship-based approach, flexible approach, building trust over time, with people within their own homes and communities where they are likely to feel the most comfortable. And this and that, I did speak to a couple of clients from that service, and that was that building trust over time, and those face-to-face and those human interactions were absolutely key to encouraging engagement amongst a group that is otherwise sort of faces numerous barriers, personal and structural barriers, to engaging with services. So this raises questions regarding the extent to which relationships can be established and maintained remotely, and the appropriateness of more short-term or episodic advice for people living in the sector with multiple vulnerabilities. So that's just a quote emphasizing the importance of a relationship-based approach. And I say, that relational, as I'm sure, I know there's many advice providers and advisors within the audience, and I'm sure many of you are aware of the sort of more relational aspects of advice, sort of that providing reassurance, building trust. So, not just thinking in terms of this kind of more intensive support model, but providing housing advice more broadly. Those relational elements, and kind of a question I have for the audience, as well, is, in your experience, to what extent can we replicate those relational aspects online? So I think we're going to talk about that a little bit in the discussion, but I just think it is a valid question that I'd wanted to raise. So so we also engaged with a peer-led housing advice scheme in Northern Ireland. This service met the challenge of providing advice during the pandemic by exploring the various sort of communication channels, support networks, and community infrastructures that were still open to people, and tailoring support accordingly. So, for example, the service realized that with this, this service worked with various sort of ethnic minority communities, and they realized that one of the communities they worked with, the Syrian community, when they get settled in Northern Ireland, they spend a week in a resettlement program, and as part of that they get set up with an email address and a WhatsApp address. So people, the service very much focused on engaging groups of people with the channel that best suited their preferences and capabilities, in this instance via WhatsApp. And there's other members of the communities which were identified as less willing to engage with those channels, so they focused on sort of establishing connections with community members who could communicate community needs, address access barriers by making community visits, for example. And one of the things we talk about in the report, which is kind of kind of a broader another theme, not so, but is this idea of sort of developing peer group effects. I'm interested in the capability of a wider diversity of actors to improve standards in the sector. So it's something that I talk about in relation to a few different studies that we've been working on, is, you know, how can we sort of you know, between the voluntary sector and also lots of different public services, we have lots of contact with people within their homes, and, you know, actually accessing and identifying people, you know, who have, you know, advice needs or support needs, information needs within the sector is kind of a key part of the battle. We know that, you know, people aren't generally aware of the services or support that's available, but we also don't really know how to identify people within the sector, particularly in England, where we don't have a national registration scheme for people that aren't coming through the housing options route. It's, you know, how do we identify people in needs of support, and how do we do that at an earlier stage in their advice journey? So I'm interested in sort of the role that the community organisations could play, and that's something that this service very much sought to draw upon. So I guess one of the questions is there a role for technology to facilitate and to support that relationship, to support that interaction? And you know, we didn't feature in the report in the end, but one of the services that we spoke to as part of this study talked about how one of the challenges they faced was people repeatedly cycling through different services, and they were, you know, the local advice community was planning to convene to discuss how those issues could be addressed. And I think that leads on quite nicely to sort of another one of our case studies, which is the sort of this targeted national advice strategy, which has been developed in Wales. And this initiative aims to simplify the advice journey, with advice provision sort of divided over 6 regions. Each region works in partnership to deliver services that respond to local priorities. So a national telephone advisory service functions alongside a regional network of parties, and people can be referred in either direction to sort of that local network of provision and the national telephone service. So the adoption of ReferNet, which is a web-based referral system on both a national and a regional level, this is sort of a key area, I would say, recent innovation within the sector. This can facilitate multi-tier collaborations by ensuring smooth transfer of data, formalizing and standardizing sort of referral routes and signposting pathways, and minimizing the chance that people will fall through the gap between different services. And regional networks are encouraged to adopt a multi-channel approach on the basis of user research that is made relevant and appropriate for people within those communities. And I thought that was quite interesting, that they were saying, well, we actually didn't want to get too tied up on this idea that one channel would necessarily work. You know, we need to kind of tailor it to those local communities. And I think what this particular case study highlights is that there's important place-related factors that contribute to the effectiveness of advice. So, for example, an advisor's knowledge of services operating on a local level, and the extent to which that it facilitates sort of onward referrals and signposting. And this has implications for the development of national remote services and the extent to which those kind of place-related factors and that sort of local knowledge can actually be replicated within national services. So, of course, people have different needs that are likely to vary from one group to another, but they also live within different geographical boundaries. So, you know, these different areas have a unique mix of advisory and non-advisory service, or a lack of. And the case study really illustrates that geographical space needs to be a point of focus when we're considering how to develop particularly national remote services. And finally, we engaged with a tenancy relations service based in London, and this was a voluntary organisation which worked with sort of local, I think it was about 7 or 8 local authorities on a commissioned on a per referral basis to support people who were facing harassment and illegal eviction in the private rented sector. This service had always kind of used a multi-channel approach when engaging with the clients, and it was quite interesting when I spoke to some of their clients, the diverse preferences that were expressed. You know, there wasn't necessarily people saying, no, I definitely need to meet face to face, or I'm definitely want to speak on the phone. Some people said, oh, because of the language, because English is not my first language, I actually prefer to receive an email, or prefer to receive a text, because then I have time to kind of reflect on it and put it. And although that service, I should say, did often use translation services, and that was key. But there was a diversity of views expressed, and it was just like, again, just reminding ourselves not to assume that many of the people they worked with were I would say quite highly vulnerable groups of people that were purposely targeted by criminal landlords and letting agents, and it's not sort of assuming that particular groups will or won't use channels in a certain way. And I mean, that point I just put there, it's not necessarily technology. Well, I guess it could be related to how do we build into that symbolic power, and the role that this organization has in signaling to the community that local authorities are committed to tackling illegal behavior and upholding tenants' right to housing. I thought it was quite interesting, but we can come back to that if necessary in the discussion. So just quickly to wrap up, I would say a few of the key points to come out of this research was, of course, the development of remote services will go some way to meet existing needs. Certain population groups will always require some level of face-to-face support. And I think, I'm sure with many people in the audience, I'm preaching to the converted, but I think it's an argument that we need to continue making. We need to continue making the argument for an effective multi-channel approach, a meaningful multi-channel approach. And what does that mean? How visible and accessible are the alternative services? What are the rules around access? Is there compulsion embedded within the system? And what are the implications of that? So it's not just, what do we mean by an effective multi-channel approach? And really developing different channels and forms of advice provision, both on a national level, but also within individual local services, making sure that this is evidence-based and not rather than driven by assumptions made in advance. And one of the services that I engaged with as part of this research said that they were very keen to sort of develop the digital offer and develop the online web pages, and they said that their feeling was that it was difficult to secure as much sort of like funding as they would have liked from sort of within the organization, because people accessing their website would, in this particular individual's opinion, weren't seen by the organization as vulnerable, and therefore less as a priority. And of course we know that within the context of like increasingly constrained resources, like organizations are forced to prioritize on the basis of sort of relative need. But nonetheless, what was interesting within their services, I saw some of the user data, and actually there was a percentage of people that were accessing the web pages and saying that they were accessing it because of the anxieties that they were experiencing, and so that's interesting, it in itself, if we're thinking that actually there are people that are coming through that channel that have certain, that are vulnerable and using it, so anyway, thinking about that. And then, another key learning point, a clear understanding of communication channels that target groups are willing to use, and that needs to inform the nature and channels of support. And again, I would say also, I would make a plea for sort of an increased understanding and perhaps further research around how people's experiences of living within the private rented sector might shape their ability to use remote advice, because we're going to be putting out next month a report around people's experiences of how living in the sector affects their well-being, and it does draw out some sort of key aspects of renting within the sector that are quite unique and that do have an impact on people's well-being. Like I said, that sort of relationship with the landlord, feelings of insecurity, regardless of whether people experience eviction, it's kind of that perceived feeling of insecurity. So just really thinking about how that and more and kind of impacts people's ability to willingness to use remote services, and how that might be differentiated between different groups of people. And just to conclude, I would say that an effective multi-channel approach should be achieved by strengthening all channels of advice provision rather than focusing primarily on the development of remote channels. So that's me done.
Excellent. Thank you, Jennifer. Such a detailed overview and some really rich case studies there. And it's a challenge, I know, to try and condense all of this into such a short presentation. But I think you did an excellent job. Also, thank you as well for flagging up the next report in the series of work we're doing. And those on the call can keep an eye on our website, housingevidence.ac.uk, or follow us on Twitter @housingevidence, and you'll be able to learn more about when that work is coming out and how you can attend the launch event for that. Great. So we have We have 81 people on the call at the moment, which is brilliant. If I could just remind people, do submit your questions through the Q&A box. One thing I forgot to say at the beginning is it'd be quite useful if you could also put in brackets maybe, you know, who you are, or say something about your role, just so we've got an idea of sort of who's in the room, who's involved in the discussion. And I should also say that the chat function is now open. I'm afraid I clicked the wrong thing at the beginning, so if you do want to speak to each other, you can now do that as well through the chat box. We do have a question from Tom Yule, but I understand that Elizabeth is going to cover some of that, so maybe in the discussion that we're about to have now, you'll get an answer to that question, Tom. So over to you, Elizabeth. We're looking for a response from you to the report, and also I understand you have some questions yourself for Jennifer.
Thank you. And thank you for the presentation, Jennifer, and for inviting me to respond. I'm really pleased to be part of a discussion on housing advice and how we grapple with the challenges and opportunities of digitisation of housing advice, and which are which. I think the audience today is quite possibly from a range of different organisations and different roles, and it's quite unusual these days for us to all be around the same table discussing. So I'm very much looking forward to allowing some time to hear what other people have got to say in the discussion. But I wanted to start by just commenting on, Jennifer, you started your presentation with just a brief covering of the background as to how we got to where we are now. And although obviously this isn't the place for rehearsing all the ups and downs that the advice sector has faced, I do think it's really, really important that that is said, because it's the context to the digitisation that we're talking about. And it explains, I think, some of the challenges that we're facing. When the government digital strategy was introduced in 2012, I mean, it was explicitly linked to cost savings, you know, driving down the budget deficit, as you indeed said. And how do we reach more people more cheaply? At the same time as legal aid funding was cut, you know, local authorities became so strapped for cash, it was very difficult for them to fund anything that wasn't statutory. So advice services had the double blow. And then the introduction of elements of compulsion into remote advice provision. I think instead of digitisation being seen as something that could enhance and offer to a wide range of people with a wide range of needs, it actually became a threat. The channels had been set against each other, pitted against each other. And it's not that long ago. I mean, this has all happened in the last 10 years. It's easily within the working lives of many, if not most, in the advice sector, in local authorities. And I think that it's not ancient history, and therefore it is worth saying, because the legacy is we have got layers of people that come from different backgrounds, all of us making up the advice sector, that are incredibly diverse, which makes these conversations that we're having now really important. Problems not just of digitisation being a threat are not just sort of imaginary. We do now have vast advice deserts across the country where people can't get housing advice from a specialist provider. But we've also undeniably got massively more digital services, remote services, serving large numbers of people that we never used to have. So I think the sector now is just as likely to contain sort of specialist housing lawyers and subject matter experts as it is to contain, you know, content designers and product managers and people that are specialists in a digital offer. And one of the things I think you had on your slide was about the conflation of advice and information. And I'd probably add remedy and support. I think there is a kind of, we speak using the same words, but we mean very different things. And I don't know to the extent to which we have a shared understanding always of what we mean by advice or information or support. And there are many, I think, that would be here today and in the sector who would very much see advice as bespoke, individual, the application of the law to a very specific set of circumstances. And information on a website at best can be really good information, but it can never be advice. And I think there would also be others here today who would absolutely consider that the high quality information and content that they produce is definitely tactical advice that they're giving to people with housing problems. And so I think I wanted to acknowledge in my remarks that as we approach digitisation, there's quite a lot of tensions, and it's not just those of us within the sector seeking to offer advice. I mean, the government legal action plan that came out in 2019 talked about offering support, which I think legal support, which I think also sort of confuses it with the kind of support, maybe to some extent, that is talked about in your Tenancy Sustainment case study. So does it matter? Is it just nitpicking? Does it matter what we call it? You know, if you have really good information on a page, does it matter whether it's called advice or not? And I think part of what I would want to say is, if we are going to seek to promote a multi-channel offer, I think we do need to be clear what it is those channels offer. And one of the problems of using advice to mean a wide range of things often is at the expense of face-to-face and casework. So there is a kind of a problem, and that's very much felt by those who offer advice, face-to-face advice and casework. So I think, how can we as a sector, with all our different skills and different backgrounds, how can we come together, given the differences in understandings, to provide that multi-channel offer that you were talking about in your recommendations? So I suppose that's my first point to you.
Yeah, I think thank you for that response, and I think that's a really important point. And I think with a lot of these things, perhaps we'll never reach full consensus on the precise definition of these terms, but I think having that conversation is an important one, and particularly that distinction between advice and information, because I think, like you said, there tends to be some confusion between the two terms, or at least a lack of clarity, you know, where, you know, I understand advice as sort of the provision of one-off, or at least time-limited communication of sort of facts, ideas, knowledge, while advice work does involve a sort of more time-consuming process of assisting people. And I mean, I think one of the key differences potentially as well, which again is something that I would want to put to the audience and maybe, you know, receive your opinion on as well, is that relational element of advice, you know, and to what extent can that be replicated online, and to what extent does that have a role in differentiating between advice and information, and that sort of that process of providing trust and reassurance and emotional support. And actually, I think there's divergent views on that as well, because I think some people I've spoke to has actually said, well, you absolutely, via the telephone or even online chat services, can provide a sense of reassurance through tone, for example, and the way you lay out content and so forth. So I would say, yes, that distinction's an important one to make. I'm afraid I don't know if I have the exact answer for how do we as a sector work towards a better consensus. I'm not sure I quite have the answer to that particular sort of aspect of your question. And also sort of, but I think another sort of important aspect of that, and perhaps that question we can put to the audience as well. We can say, you know, do the other people have you? How do we reach a consensus? Is that important? And is, you know, and how do we get there? And then I think another important sort of aspect of that, because when we're talking about, you know, the difference between advice and information, and we're thinking about how does that fit within a multi-channel approach, but also within a multi-tiered strategy, you know, and how do people get sort of move seamlessly from one channel to the next, and at what point does it move from information to advice? So if you look at the civil tribunal in British Columbia, you know, where they have interactive, tailored online information platforms as a first stage of a multi-tiered dispute resolution system. So you're not just encountered with static information pages, as is often the case when you're looking for advice in this country. You're actually receiving sort of tailored templates, letters, and so forth to your particular circumstances. Is that information or is that advice? I mean, would you have a view on that?
Well, actually, that's quite interesting, because that leads me into something else I was quite keen for us to talk about, which, I mean, I am of the view that if we're going to, that really bespoke advice involves some sort of two-way process with a real human being about circumstances, applying them to the case, because you could have two different people with similar circumstances, but the advice might be different to either of them, and it's very difficult to get that level of nuance in a digital tool, unless it's using digital to enable two people to speak to each other, I think, which leads me on to asking about advice bots and the extent to which they're useful. I know you have that case study from the local citizens advice that you talked about in your presentation, and I know advice bots are quite popular with some, but it isn't always entirely clear to me quite who they're popular with, and and you absolutely recognise the limitations. And also I recognise in the process of creating digital or anything new, actually, it's always a bit messy, and we have to explore things that then later we perhaps might refine or see as less useful. But I wonder, I have a question really, because it's not the first time an advice bot has been devised. I know there was a few years ago, the Law Society was involved in a hackathon. They created a virtual assistant to deal with damp and disrepair. It was to work with an Amazon Echo, and you could ask a series of questions. And it was very much held up by many as a kind of groundbreaking use of technology to help people navigate their way through disrepair. The example that they often used was a private rented sector tenant with damp. But when I looked at it, I was quite concerned. I found it really binary. It didn't flag all the things that I would want to flag, but it did go on to offer advice, to telling the user to contact their landlord without any further information about the consequences it could bring for them. And it even offered template letters that it would offer you could print out. And that was something that Ask Colin, it was called, and that was something that was held up very much as a useful tool. But actually, how many people does it really help, and is it not quite dangerous? It's one of those things where sometimes I wonder if a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. So I suppose I have a question about advice bots, and back to your point about information versus advice. How useful are advice bots and virtual assistants in providing advice where you don't get to interact with a human being who has some sort of subject matter expertise?
I mean, I think the jury's still out on that to an extent, because I think, yeah, whilst we have had a couple of iterations, I think that more kind of interactive form of sort of information or advice provision is in its infancy within the UK. But I think really the crux of the matter here is that we need to see digital as a complement and not a replacement for face-to-face advice. And I think that's where sort of, when you talked about kind of that really important background and how it's kind of these two channels have been pitted against each other, and actually the introduction of or the push towards remote advice provision in order to justify the reduction in face-to-face provision is almost kind of made it seem like either or sometimes the narratives presented us, but they need to complement each other. And I think it is important to recognize that the increase in digital services is partly demand driven as well. So there is a significant increase in people looking to obtain information for problems with the legal dimension online. And there is reports from sort of various advice services that I've spoken to that said, particularly under COVID, there's increased demands from a new cohort of advice seekers. So people that are perhaps experiencing civil legal problems for the first time and now need to access sort of information or advice. This group is thought, again, it's an assumption, we need to test it, but it's thought to be more IT literate, and therefore more able to access support online. So I think, when we're talking about, I think the jury's still out to an extent with the advice bots, because we haven't got to the point where they're being necessarily properly tailored yet. Like, we don't understand necessarily specifically which group they would be most effective for. Obviously, it'd be people that are more IT literate, people that are probably are fine with just that one little bit of information. But how does that fit in with a wider multi-channel approach as well? Is it compulsory that people come through an advice bot, and what are the implications of that? Or do we want to improve our digital offer to the extent that people will choose that offer if it's appropriate for them and if they can use it? And I think, just coming back to what you mentioned earlier about that sort of dichotomy that's been presented, I think the world we live in now, it's no longer, and my views have shifted on this as well. I think, having previously done research around homeless people's experience of using digital technology, and sort of the significant barriers that many people do face, to where I am now. And I think where I am now is, my view is, we can't really talk about whether or not digital advice is appropriate. It's when is it appropriate and for whom. And And I think there is potential to increase the level of digitization for people with more generalist inquiries, people that are able to self-help, are able to access information, but we can't focus exclusively on that to the expense of people that need sort of more ongoing and, more specialized housing advice. It needs to be a more holistic sort of comprehensive advice and support ecosystem, which we're developing, not just sort of these self-help information platforms. If we're focusing exclusively on that, then that would be a problem, I would say.
So that's so can I just put one final point to you before we move, because I'm interested to hear what others want to contribute that are in the audience, but is going back to the point you made about the Civil Tribunal in British Columbia. I know that was very much based on the rechtwijzer system, I think, in Holland, and I think, which relates to these, how does the funding environment impact on what is developed, and what is the impact of government policy in other areas on how we develop housing advice services in a digital sense? Because I agree with you, digital is here to stay. We've got to work out how we manage it and use it to our best advantage. But I think we have seen over and over again funding given to remote services that would, for example, direct people away from courts. At the moment, there's the rental mediation pilot that's been introduced for housing possession cases that is intended to clear the backlog that's been created during the pandemic, but is offered to people as a sort of remote mediation prior to a possession hearing. But some £3 million has been given to that, and yet we know that experience has told us and research has told us over and over again that mediation, where there's such a power imbalance, it's not often very successful. A tiny number of people use it, if at all, and I'm not sure that it's been terribly successful so far in terms of numbers. And the rechtwijzer example that I was giving, that the Dutch Legal Aid Board similarly funded sort of dispute resolution tools that at the time in sort of 2007, or about 15 years ago, they were producing very tailored question and answer digital tools that would guide people through processes that were considered to be quite extraordinary and ahead of their time, but nobody actually really used it. And in the end, the funding was pulled because the imperative of the funder wasn't really was what guided it, not necessarily what the users wanted. So I think there is this mismatch between sometimes what gets funded and where the funding is, and what people want, what users want. So I guess, how do we move forward with that user need and channel choice when the funding environment isn't entirely neutral? And it may be that actually that question is one that could go as much to the audience as it is to you, Jennifer.
Absolutely. I'd be interested to hear people's views, but I would just say very briefly, I think we absolutely need to move away from this assumption, which I think despite sort of the promises made of alternative services, and this idea that belief that self-help channels of advice necessarily offer a viable alternative or replacement for face-to-face advice, which I think is where sort of the digital by default agenda has headed. The benefits are so extensive. Traditional modes of service delivery are only justified under exceptional circumstances, so digital is often presented as a replacement rather than operating as a supplement. And I think we need to move past that. And I think we need to move past that by probably thinking about how different channels of advice provision in different contexts are sort of embedded within people's sort of everyday experiences of engaging with technology within the context of the specific problems that they're facing. So really focusing more on people's, the experiences and circumstances of different groups of people. So just finishing on that, I could talk about sort of short-term funding cycles and how that's very unhelpful in delivering sort of longer-term innovation as well. But I'll stop talking now so we can take a few questions from the audience, I think. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks, Elizabeth, as well, for that excellent response and some really engaging and thoughtful questions. I think we could easily have done with at least an extra half hour to discuss all these issues, because there's just so much to chew over, but we've got a number of questions here from the audience. In the last 10 minutes, I'm afraid we're not going to be able to get through all of them, but what we might try to do is answer some of the questions after the event as well. So I'll save a copy and try and get back to you on those. First, we've got a question from Anonymous. Are we treating, and some of these questions you may have touched on the answers already, but it would be useful to have a bit more elaboration. So are we treating the symptom rather than the cause? Well, digitisation will undoubtedly improve accessibility and information provision for a large group of people. The context of the 2012 digitisation work was cost cutting, removing face-to-face provision, shutting courts and creating advice desks. Whilst flying the flag for digitisation, do we have to call for better funding and the reopening of face-to-face advice providers?
Absolutely. I would just say very briefly, I think overall, I would say within this context, UK and devolved governments need to improve what I'd call the advice and information or ecosystem, which is available to tenants in the private renter sector as a matter of urgency. And I think, any commitment to interventions. So, I mean, and there's been kind of commitments made for early intervention, but it's been accompanied by very little resource investment. So absolutely additional and sufficient resource investment, including for publicly funded face-to-face advice, I think is essential. Absolutely. I don't know if Elizabeth would agree with me on that.
I mean, I would be doing a huge disservice to the sector if I didn't say that absolutely, and the reinstating of legal aid across a whole range of subjects, not just housing, but it's social welfare law subjects. But housing is what we're talking about today. I mean, it was precisely a lot of the early intervention, the preventative work that was cut and was removed from scope. And, we're now almost reinventing early intervention as a new thing, whereas we did it for years in the sector really, really well, not without its problems, obviously, but without funding, without proper funding for casework, not just advice, but casework. It's really hard to see how we can really meet the needs of the people that we know, because it's not that we don't know, are more likely to have housing related problems and clusters of problems.
Great, thanks. We also have a question from John Gallagher from Shelter. So John says, my concern is that however good and user-friendly a digital platform is, people in all sectors, but particularly in the private rented sector, need more than just advice. Because of the power imbalance and the complexity of remedies, they need casework and advocacy. Isn't there a danger, therefore, that the digital imperative will simply be used to disguise the fact that people are not getting the actual help they need to resolve their problem? Doesn't there need to be more of an emphasis on outcomes? Elizabeth, do you want to respond first?
Absolutely. I think some of the work that was done a number of years ago by the Legal Services Research Centre actually highlighted some of the outcomes from remote advice rather than face-to-face advice, because face-to-face advice inevitably went hand to hand with casework, and it did show that in-house that there was a greater chance of a much more substantive outcome, like, if you had disrepair, that it would be fixed rather than that you would just go away feeling better informed. And so the actual substantive outcomes from case-to-case, face-to-face casework have been drawn out in research. We know, I mean, I know the digital environment is changing, it's changing how we work, but there are some things that we do know. We don't need to reinvent the wheel on everything or say that we don't know everything. We do know that casework is absolutely essential. And because it draws on that subject matter expertise applied to individual circumstances, not everything can be sorted out online. Doesn't mean we don't need good digital information and services online, but it absolutely doesn't do everything. So yes, I completely agree with John's point.
Great. Well, Emma Lawson from Citizens Advice also recognises an opportunity in digital advice provision, in this case here, to join up housing advice with other areas, since people often present with complex problems, she says. So, for example, their access to housing help depending on immigration status, and immigration law is so hard to get hold of. Digital is at least a step. So her question is the crossover of advice areas something you've thought about in your research, Jennifer?
I didn't look at that particular, I mean, we talked about sort of obviously the overlapping nature of people's needs and the clustering of legal issues. Obviously that's part of the issue here. I wouldn't say we had sort of the chance in this project to look at how advice provision can be delivered remotely across these different topics? I think that's a really important question. I do think in terms of the linking up of legal with non-legal services, I know that's not directly advice provision, but it's relevant. The adoption of ReferNet and this online system of referrals with that's been adopted at a national level, national and a local level within Wales is a really good example on how we sort of link different advice and support providers together in order to meet people's overlapping needs. So that's
great. Thanks, Jennifer. So I'm just going to try and fire through another couple of questions before we have to wrap up. There are lots here, but we're not going to get through them all. Katrina Reid from Public Health Scotland says, are we clear on the learning and support needs of the workforce who are delivering digitised services? What support is available for the workforce to help build an understanding of the challenges that people seeking advice might experience when using digital services? Elizabeth, do you want to respond to that one?
Sorry, I was just reading it as you were saying it. Let me just...
I can answer it.
Okay.
Sorry, I've lost it again.
That's all right. Jennifer, do you want to say something and then we'll come to Elizabeth?
Oh, on the
I just think, yeah, sorry, I think that's a very important question, and it's a crucial issue, and I don't think it's been given proper recognition within government. And it became very apparent in my previous role, where I worked with sort of national membership organisations. So day to day, I was sort of communicating with lots of different homelessness support organisations, and there seemed to be very little sort of support available to staff, or even acknowledgement that the shift to remote services also involves sort of an upskilling of the sector. And I saw that particularly in the case when we were working with kind of like small organizations, community-led organizations, day centers, drops in some of the services that are, you know, dealing with people with some of the most complex needs, and some of the people that face the greatest barriers to adapting to the channel shift. There was a real need there that I think was largely being unaddressed. So I think it's a valid question. I think that could be a research project in itself, to be honest. I don't know if Elizabeth is aware of anything that's been done, but no.
I'm not really, but I do I agree that I think it's one of those invisible things, isn't it, that in the workforce, the skills that are needed. And just, I mean, we know that, you know, some local authorities have used things like portals for making homeless applications, and, you know, things that obviously hugely disadvantage clients who are precisely in the position where they can't benefit from that sort of thing, or can't take advantage of that sort of thing. And then you've got staff who are having to support people through that. And you say, is that they themselves might need digital support at the same time as they're required to give it to others?
Excellent. Well, listen, thank you both for dealing with so many questions in quick succession there. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up now without being able to answer all of them. But what I've done is I've taken a copy of the questions, and I think perhaps between us we can maybe get back to people with some answers to those unanswered questions after the event. So it just remains for me to say thank you, first of all, to Elizabeth for joining us for today's session and preparing such a response and engaging in such a great discussion on this research. So thank you, Elizabeth, for doing that. Jennifer as well, thank you for the research and for your presentation today. And thank you to everyone else who came along. As I say, we had 81 people on the call today from across the housing sector, a really diverse group of people, and it's really great to see that. So you can keep up with us, as I say, on our website at housingevidence.ac.uk, and you can follow us on Twitter at Housing Evidence to keep up with future publications and events. So thank you again. Have a great day, everyone, and see you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.